Okay. Now, we're carrying on in Genesis chapter 1. So the actual description of God's creation work begins in verse 3 as he starts to fashion the formless and empty and dark earth into the universe of human habitation. And last week, we looked at verses 3 through 5 where God speaks light into existence. And then he creates the phenomenon of day and night, daytime and nighttime, which is the most basic rhythm of human experience, that day and night that we all know. And I pointed out that there's every reason to understand these days as ordinary days, just regular days of human experience, days of 24 hours. And the resistance to doing so, it comes not from the text, but it comes from beliefs or convictions that are drawn elsewhere. Now, there are people who will defend, yeah, well, that's right, but we should do that. But that's where they're coming. They're not coming from the text. And I noted that some scholars believe that Moses intended the first day to begin with the darkness of verse 2 rather than the light of verse 3. But I side with those scholars who think that the day began with the creation of light. In other words, Moses probably, in my judgment, is saying that the creation days were measured from light to light, from morning to morning, instead of from darkness to darkness, from evening to evening. Now, given that understanding that I mentioned last week, Christine asked me after the class, well, if that's the right understanding, she didn't put it that way, but this is the idea. If that's the right understanding, well, then how did the Jews come to reckon days to begin at sundown, right, as they clearly did? And that is not, so I told her in an email, I don't know if she got it, but I told her in an email that historically, it's not recorded how that came about. Okay, how that came about. But since the Jews are not commanded to reckon days as expressed in Genesis 1, from light to light, well, perhaps the requirement, this cultic requirement in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32, that the Sabbath of the Day of Atonement be observed from evening to evening. Maybe that is what then became, that's what became the general method of reckoning the beginning of a day from evening. That cultic requirement there related to the Day of Atonement from evening to evening. But I don't know anywhere that you can go and find that history tracked out. Okay, so that was what I said there, and I think there's something to that. All right, let's pick back up in verses 6 to 8. It says, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that are under the expanse from the waters that are above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heavens, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. Now, some have argued that this Hebrew noun, rakia, they have argued that, and it's that word is traditionally, in the King James, it's traditionally rendered firmament. And some have argued that word necessarily connotes something solid. But as a Hebrew scholar, Jack Collins notes, that's not the best interpretation of the Hebrew. That word, rakia, it's related to a verb that means to hammer out or to stretch out, particularly used with a piece of metal. Okay, so it has that sense, but as Herman Ostel says, it's the idea of spreading out that carries over to the noun, not the idea of a metallic substance. You see, so it's related to the verb of spreading out, often this metal, but when you go to the noun, what carries over is spreading out, not the metallic substance. Now, recognizing that the rakia depicts something that is spread out over the earth, Kenneth Matthews, in his commentary, he says, there is no indication, however, that the author conceived of it as a solid mass, a firmament that supported a body of water above it. You see, Gerhard Alder says there's certainly no indication that the expanse must be considered a firm substance itself. John Sailhammer says it would be unlikely that the narrative would have in view a solid partition or vault that separates the earth from the waters above, citing Klaus Westermann. So you have many modern translations, like the English Standard Version, which this is, they render it expanse. You see, and there are a number of them like this. The NIV does, New American Standard, New English Translation, Christian Standard Bible, and others. That's why they render it that way. So not to be caught up in this idea that we're somehow suggesting that there is solidity to this. And by calling the expanse that he created, this rakia that he created, by calling it heavens here in verse 8 and specifying in verses 14 through 17 that the heavenly bodies he created are in the heavens. So the rakia, the expanse he creates, he calls it, he names it heavens. And then in verses 14 to 17, these heavenly bodies that he creates, they are in the heavens. He makes clear then that the expanse that he created on day 2 was not merely the earth's atmosphere, but it included what we know as outer or interstellar space. Because it is in that space, in that expanse, that he puts the heavenly bodies that he creates. And you can see this, I think, quite clearly in Psalm 19:1, where he says, in parallelism, he says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above, rakia, proclaims his handiwork. And Danny Faulkner, he says, Faulkner is an astronomer, but he's also involved a lot in creation work. He says, here the Hebrew word rakia in Psalm 19:1 is rendered sky, or in the translation I read, sky above. This verse says the same two things in different ways. However, the parallelism works only if the two subjects, Shemayim and rakia, are equivalent on a conceptual level, i.e. they refer essentially to the same thing. These two entities are exactly equated in Genesis chapter 1, verse 8, where he calls the rakia heavens, so they are the same. Therefore, if the rakia made on day 2 is the earth's atmosphere, then the subject of Psalm 19:1 is the earth's atmosphere. No one believes this to be the case. For Psalm 19:1 is universally accepted as referring to the celestial heavens, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, right? The rakia declares his handiwork. He says, so this is not the earth's atmosphere, and I think that's correct. I think this is all of interstellar space, outer space, however you want to understand it. Now, if the expanse that is the heavens, if that does include interstellar space, if it does include the celestial heavens, as seems to be the case, well, then the waters above the expanse cannot be the source of water that falls to the earth as rain or snow, as some people claim. Right? So people say, okay, the waters above, we got waters above, we got waters below, the waters above, that's what comes down as rain. I don't think that's right. Because I think the expanse is interstellar space, and so that's not the source of the water. And that fits with the fact that God does not name the waters above the expanse as he does the waters below. Paul Seeley, a number of decades ago in an article in the Westminster Theological Journal, he says, by not naming the waters above the firmament, expanse, as he named the waters below, God signified, he's giving you a sign that he had excluded them from the world made for man. And so that's how I understand it, is that these things are not part of the world made for man. In other words, those waters, they were removed from human experience. They're not mentioned because they're mentioned not because they're involved with mankind, but because God's act, this act of spreading them out, from the waters below. That was an exercise of dominion. That was God's dominion over it. It was his act of imposing order upon this disordered start. So he expands, he takes them out like that. They have nothing to do with human life. They are not named as being part of our world and experience, but they are mentioned because he is placing order. Okay, it's his act of dominion over them. So, and in keeping with their exclusion, this is the way I understand it. In keeping with their exclusion from mankind's world, those waters are not mentioned again. The waters above the expanse are not mentioned again, except in Psalm 148, verse 4. 148:4, which, and then the very next verse in verse 5 of Psalm 148, it makes clear that 148:4 is referring back to creation. So back to Genesis 1:7. Okay, so that's consistent as I look at this. These things, he exercises his dominion. They're taken out of relevance to the human world. And it's reported simply because it is part of his act of ordering. Now, it's true that precipitation, rainfall, is said to come from the heavens. There are a number of texts like that, but the source of that water is never said to be above the heavens. You see, so yes, rain comes from the heavens. For example, Psalm 104:13 says that God waters the mountains from his lofty abode, but it doesn't say how he does that. You see, it doesn't say anything about he uses waters from above the expanse to do that. That poetic text is compatible with God acting from his lofty abode to generate and direct rain from within the earth's atmosphere. So you can't look at that and say that that's an indication that those waters have anything to do. E.J. Young, I think I've mentioned him before. He was a very well-known Old Testament scholar at Westminster. He said, "I'm unable to accept the opinion that the waters above the expanse refer to the clouds, for this position does not do justice to the language of the text, which states that these waters are above the expanse." Okay, so I'm not alone in thinking that. I'll let you see this. If you think this is odd what this guy's saying, I'm not the lone ranger there, but I think it's significant. So clouds, you see, they're part of the divine recycling mechanism for distributing the waters on the earth to various parts of the earth. And I think they come up later, in fact, as we work our way through. You'll see when I think that comes into effect. Now, the statement, you may be wondering, the statement in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, that at the start of Noah's flood, it says the windows of heaven were opened. Well, that doesn't mean that the waters above the expanse were poured out onto the earth. Some would look at that and say, you see, no, that's what that means. No, it doesn't mean that. God miraculously brought torrential rain for 40 days and 40 nights as part of his judgment of flooding the earth, but nothing is said about waters above the expanse. You say, well, what could this idea of opening windows? It's just a way of expressing of God's abundant provision of rain. And you can see in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, it says there that the blessing that is promised there in Malachi 3:10 to be poured out through the windows of heaven, very same phrase, to be poured out through the windows of heaven, almost certainly is a reference to rain. That is the blessing that God is going to provide. He's going to pour it out through the windows of heaven in Malachi 3:10. And nobody thinks that the source of that rain is waters above the expanse. You see, some people say, no, the great flood of Noah, you see, you had these waters sitting up where he opens the thing, floods, and that's how you get all that water. No. Because you have the same thing in Malachi 3:10. It's simply a way of saying, you see, referring to the abundant rain sent by God. So this is what I think is going on here with the expanse and the waters above, that they have just been taken out. Then he says in 9:13, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the third day. So dry land was made to appear by gathering the waters under the heavens, waters that were covering the entire earth, right? There is no dry land. So we have this, whatever these waters here, like I said, the deep is an unspecified depth. Maybe inside a gigantic ball of water, and God, then he separates the water. He creates the expanse where he separates waters above the expanse from waters below the expanse, but the waters below the expanse at this point are still covering the entire earth because there's no dry land. Right? But he creates dry land. He makes it appear by gathering those waters that are still covering the entire earth into a defined area. Okay, meaning that the elevation levels, the topography of the earth, the elevation levels of the surface of the earth were miraculously altered so that all of the water could be contained in the newly created lower elevations. Right, do you see? So we've got this, the earth, there's no dry land, it's all water. And then he has the dry land appear by the water draining off and leaving and having the dry land appear that way. So to do that, he is altering the topography. He is creating basins into which the water can flow. And so this is what he does in creating the dry land. And though they're gathered to one place, these waters are presumably called seas, plural, because a huge body of water, if you picture a land, one place, a massive continent, and then it's surrounded by a huge body of water. A huge body of water can have different names at different locations. For instance, you could have the North Sea, the South Sea, but it's one body of water. So I'm thinking that's what is happening. You know, so that maybe that's what's going on. Now, however, the separation of the land and seas, however that was done, however that was accomplished, these massive tectonic changes in creating these basins to receive the water for dry land to appear, that would, from a naturalistic process, from a naturalistic perspective, that would render the land inhospitable to life for some time. I mean, that's some serious stuff going on. Okay, in terms of heat and everything else. So from a naturalistic perspective, you wouldn't be able to have vegetation that very same day. But God, right, in his power, that doesn't bother him. He simply dispels the heat. If the heat was a problem, he dispels that and took care of anything else that was necessary to make the land suitable for vegetation the very same day. John MacArthur says, if the laws of nature set limits on the creative power of God, we might as well rule out miracles altogether. He says, but the laws of nature place no limit on what God can do. And that's certainly right. Now, as most modern commentators recognize, verses 11 and 12, they refer to two distinct types of vegetation instead of three. There's a word here that usually just means grass. But in this context, it looks like it's a generic term, vegetation, for the two specified types of vegetation. That's how most commentators look at it. Kenneth Matthews, for example, he says the vegetation is of two kinds expressed in general categories: plants producing seed and fruit trees whose fruit possesses seeds. So it looks like you have these two kinds. John Sailhammer, in his commentary, says the selectivity of the creation account can be seen in the fact that it focuses only on the seed-bearing plants and fruit trees. Those are the plants that are for man's food. No other forms of vegetation are mentioned. But we see in chapter 1, verse 30, that God also created green plants. So it's not only here, you see, restricted, so there's more involved. But rather than create the plants, I think this is just an interesting little detail. That rather than create the plants yielding seed and the fruit trees bearing fruit in a mature state instantly, which he certainly could do instead of simply having them appear in a mature state, God had those plants and trees sprout. They sprouted from the ground. He had them sprout and grow with miraculous speed to maturity. That day they were yielding seed and bearing fruit. But he had them sprout and grow. And Faulkner says, it's very easy to imagine this very rapid day 3 sprouting and growing to maturity of plants as resembling a time-lapse movie of plant growth today. And I just like that. You've seen time-lapse photography, right? Where we're doing something and all of a sudden we just watch this thing grow up. Well, just like that. You see, and that's how I picture it, and I think that's something that is helpful there, where you see that going on. So Moses says that the earth brought forth this vegetation, each according to its kind. Each according to its kind. And the significance of kinds, I think, is well expressed by Kenneth Matthews, where he says, the vegetation, like the waters, is given prescribed boundaries. They produce according to their various kinds. Kind, the Hebrew word is min, is used for broad categories of animals, birds, and fish. Any attempt to correlate kind with a modern term such as species is unwarranted, though the awareness of distinctive kinds is closer to a scientific description than is found in pagan cosmogonies. Just as separations are integral to creation, so are distinctions among living beings as indicated by their kinds. Creation and procreation according to kind indicates that God has established parameters for creation. But the term is never used of humanity. There aren't kinds of humans. There is one kind, humankind. Right? He says the term's never used of humanity, showing that we are a unique order of creation. Furthermore, ethnic distinctions are incidental to the commonality of the human family. We are all one family, all descended from Adam and Eve, all one family. And so this is what he's saying. Now, this to me is interesting, you see, for a number of reasons. But see, Scripture, it indicates that God cares about the distinctiveness and the generational integrity of the various kinds of living things that he miraculously created in the beginning. Right? He cares about their distinctiveness and that they reproduce according to kind, their generational integrity, their generational maintenance of that distinctiveness. You see, God cares about that. But if, as the evolution story claims, and as people who believe, they say, no, I believe everything. I believe the Bible. I just believe that God created through the process of evolution. But if, as the evolution story claims, all different categories of life forms, all the different kinds of life that have ever existed, that have ever lived, they descended from a common ancestor by gradual variation over the ages, well, then one kind of creature necessarily and regularly gave birth to another kind. Right? If I start with one kind, and then over descent with modification, I'm getting all of the other kinds, well, then necessarily, right, we have this regularly, necessarily, you have one kind over time giving birth to another kind. And that requires one to believe that God created in a way that was inconsistent with his interest in the distinctiveness and the integrity of kinds. Right? Because you see that he cares about the kinds and their integrity and their distinctiveness being maintained through generations. And yet if this is the way he's creating, then he's creating in a way that is contrary to how he's revealing he's creating. I'm just looking, I said, if you're telling me that God created that way, why would he describe it in a way that is so wildly at odds with that? Right? I don't see any way you could get that from this. If you just want to parachute in and say, no, it must be saying that. It's clearly not saying that. And yet you have people say, no, I think it's fine. I just believe God created through evolution. I don't know how you can do that. I know people do. You know, and they'd say, well, I'm a bonehead. But I'm just saying, I just don't see how it is. See, if God created the multitude of kinds through modified descent from a common ancestor, I just don't see how he would reveal and portray that work in a way that so clearly indicates the contrary. I just don't think that's reasonable. Then he says in 14 to 19, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars, which would include planets. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So God, he creates the heavenly bodies. He creates the sun, the moon, the stars, as I say, which includes planets, because this is the meaning of that word is broader than our technical concept of star. And he creates it to serve these things, to serve several purposes. So they're to give light upon the earth, and by doing so, they are to separate the day from the night, the light from the darkness. In other words, they are to serve as distinguishing celestial features of daytime and nighttime. The sun's visibility and its light dominate or rule the day, whereas the sun's absence and the stars' visibility define the night, with the moon dominating or ruling the night when it's visible because of its greater brightness. And this means that from this point on, the function of that miraculous, localized light source that we have talked about, that he creates in the beginning, from this point, the function of that localized light source, that source is played regarding day and night, it's transferred to the sun. Now the sun assumes that role, and the heavenly bodies also serve as a celestial calendar. You see, as a marker of seasons and days and years as their positions in the sky vary on schedule. So this is what he's talking about here, and to fulfill God's intention that the heavenly bodies give light upon the earth and serve as these distinguishing features of daytime and nighttime and as a celestial calendar, well, then they would need to be visible on earth. Right? For them to fulfill his intention for them, they would need to be visible on earth, which means that the light from those objects You see, most of which are unimaginable distances from Earth. Well, the light from those objects would need to reach the Earth that day. Right? If they're going to carry out and do what God intends them to do to fulfill the purpose for which he created them, as he has just explained, well, then they're going to have to be visible. And yet we know that some of these things are very, very far away. And this is the thing that people say, well, how you understand things in reality, you can't be right because, no, these things are so far away. We know that at the speed of light, it would take a long time for them to get here. And so we know then, see, that the light I'm seeing has to be that old. Does it? You see, is that in fact right? I don't think that's right at all, you see. That God, he simply brings these things. He brings the light here. He miraculously accelerated the processes in deep space, in the cosmos beyond the solar system, so that the deep space experienced however many years are needed of process, just like the time-lapse photography. It experienced that much process in that short a time, the equivalent of however many millions or billions of years of process you need in less than a day. Can God create these things and just think and go, can he do that? Yeah, he can do that. So I said, no. It's too. I said, don't you realize that you're eliminating the possibility of God in fulfillment of the purpose he tells us that he brings this to earth that fast? Okay? How could he do it? He's God. Right? Did he dilate time? Did he just do the time-lapse thing? But he could do that and have that light come here. Time-lapse photography, I think that's helpful. Here's Danny Faulkner again. He says, as we have seen, the plants, as I say, he's an astronomer. He says, the plants made on day 3 rapidly came to maturity. The reason for this was that the plants could not fulfill their purpose unless they rapidly matured. In a similar manner, the astronomical bodies could not fulfill their purposes unless they were readily visible. In this sense, the light had to be matured. No one suggests that the rapid development of dry land, plants, birds, land animals, and even man happened naturally. Rather, God rapidly and miraculously brought these things together to maturity. In a similar manner, why could not the light from distant astronomical bodies have undergone the same sort of process? Hence, my solution to the light travel time problem, which people throw at people like me, who believe that creation and everything is, oh, you can't solve that. You see, because I know that things are light years, they're further away. So let's say like Cassiopeia is 16,000 light years. Light years is a distance, right? How far light travels in a year. So it would have to take 16,000 years for that light for you to see it. Would it? That's what I say. I don't get it. Right? Now, I can see if I'm an atheist and I'm somebody who doesn't believe in an almighty God who's creating and revealing to me what he did, well, okay. That makes sense, but I'm not in that category. I'm in the category that worships the almighty God. And this is what he's done. Okay. Solution to light travel proposes that God rapidly and miraculously brought the light of distant astronomical bodies, astronomical sources to the earth on day 4. And I think that is, that's satisfying me. That's the way I look at that. Now, there have been creationist physicists. We got some pretty wild guys. And, they have played with how you could answer this naturalistically. In other words, trying to work with Einstein's relativity and all this kind of stuff. Okay, I'm happy to have them play around in that. And if you wind up saying, hey, I can explain how all of the light gets here through some kind of process of creation in which I'm giving a more physical explanation in keeping with what we understand about modern physics, well, have at it. But for my money, I just think of God just thinking and going, okay, that satisfies me. I think God can do that. Now, the fact God created the heavenly bodies after he created the earth and vegetation, well, it's contrary, right, to the dominant creation story of Western society. This is crazy talk to people. And I know, right? This is crazy talk to people because the dominant creation story of Western society is that the universe erupted out of a quantum field. Okay, quantum, where did that come from? It has properties, it's not nothing. But in any event, the idea is the universe erupted out of a quantum field some 13.7 billion years ago, and then without any direction from a mind, without any planning, it naturally unfolded into the universe that we know, complete with the spontaneous generation of life on earth and the fantastic diversification of that life into all of the life forms through blind chance processes. Okay, that's the story. That's the creation story of Western society, that they will look down their nose at you if you don't accept that. You're just an uneducated buffoon. Okay, but this is the idea. Now, part of that story is that stars developed billions of years before the earth. So the creation account of day 4, it's a real problem, right? For those who want to force the Bible to fit that conventional narrative. And you say, well, what do they do about it? Well, they do so by saying, well, the text doesn't really mean that God created the heavenly bodies on day 4. The text only means that pre-existing heavenly bodies became visible on day 4. Or that pre-existing heavenly bodies were appointed to their role on day 4. Now, that strikes me and many other people you see as simply twisting the text rather than listening to it. Okay? It is plain as the nose on my face. I mean, people look at me, I don't say that, I believe the Bible. Okay. I don't try not to jump on people like this, but I can't tell you how clearly this seems to me that he's saying he created these things on day 4. Right? And I don't want to just say, no, he didn't say that. He didn't mean that. He couldn't have meant that. No, it seems pretty clear. Just like he made these other things, he made these things on day 4. Okay, so the adjustment needs to come from the other side. Don't keep coming into me and telling me, I don't know what the Bible's saying. I need to fix that. I need to say it doesn't really say, all you can say from Genesis, all it says is that God created everything. Really? It's an awful lot of words to say that. That's all he's saying. Just says he created, then I get to fill in everything. Okay, I don't think that's what's happening. All right, I got 5 minutes, 20 to 23. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. So God creates all the kinds of sea creatures and birds, and that word birds means flying creatures. So it's broader, can include other things than birds. But he creates all the kinds of sea creatures and birds, and he blesses them and then instructs them to multiply. And as the Old Testament scholars Kyle and Delich, they note, quote, it is not stated that only a single pair was created of each kind, end quote. And on the contrary, the indication is that, quote, the animals were created not only in a rich variety of genera and species, but in large numbers of individuals, So I don't think we always think that way. But the sea creatures, they're divided into two categories. Categories that are explained by Victor Hamilton as extremely large and mostly water-related mammals or reptiles, crocodile, whale, large snakes, hence RSV, the great sea monsters. And two, smaller fish and other more diminutive aquatic creatures who either glide through the water or creep along its bed. As I said, the word here, the word birds, can refer specifically to birds, but it's larger, it's broader than that, can include other things. It means flying creatures. And of course, it's unclear, right? When God creates this expanse and calls it heavens, it's unclear precisely at what altitude does heavens begin. You see, that's unclear because there's some ill-defined zone between heaven and earth, right? There's some ill-defined, so precisely where it is, we don't know. But birds flying in that zone, they appear from earth to fly across the face of the expanse, right? So between heaven and earth, I've got birds flying. So what are they doing? Here's the expanse, and they fly across the face of the expanse. And so that's what he's talking about. Birds fly across the face of the expanse of the heavens. Now, it's common to note that verse 22 is the first occasion of the divine blessing. And let me tell you, I'll just read to what Kenneth Matthews says, and I'll maybe let you out 30 seconds early. We'll see. You know, I'm just being kind. Kenneth Matthews, he says, this blessing indicates that the creatures are in a favored position before the Lord. Here at creation, by this simple dictum, God provides these creatures with the security of a continued existence. The animal world is valued by God and is placed under the caretaking of humans in 126:28. The startling reversal of God's attitude toward his world of creatures by the flood exhibits the enormity of the world's corruption. Nevertheless, his renewed covenant with the world includes these creatures who will again be fruitful and multiply in number. You see, so this is, I think this is here in this blessing that God does care about, which is another thing you see in the typical evolution scenario, is that his process of creating is red in tooth and claw, where it is a process of suffering and death. And I just think God cares about these things. Why do you think that? Those things are a product of the invasion of sin. They are not the product of God's initial process of creation. I just think that's, putting that on God, I think, is a mistake. But anyway, you got 13 seconds. Enjoy it. Thanks.